Hi, my name's John Downing, and I am a limnologist and ecologist. This is session 2 of Aquatic Ecology. In this session, we're going to talk about the diversity of aquatic ecosystems that exist on the planet, and so we'll walk through some definitions and we'll have a look at a variety of different kinds of systems that are important as aquatic ecosystems on Earth. My objectives for session 2 are for us to learn what ecosystems are, to learn the names and attributes of diverse aquatic ecosystems, and then learn about the hierarchy of things that influence aquatic systems, and finally understand the factors that distinguish major types of aquatic ecosystems from one another. So first to the ecosystem. Tansley defined an ecosystem as a biotic community or assemblage and its associated physical environment in a specific place. So the ecosystem, as shown in this graphic from the new version of the Calf Limnology book, is that ecosystems are composed of communities, where communities are built from a variety of populations of individual species. Those species or those organisms within the populations are made of cells, and those cells are made up of organelles. There's a very strong hierarchy of effects, but the processes that are important and the time course over which we study them are very different. So you can see that an ecosystem is made up of a variety of different components of the biological components as well as the physical environment. The setting also alters the function at many levels. So there's a sort of a hierarchy going from the low level of biological effects on ecosystems up to very regional properties that drive ecosystem functions. So if we start with the regional properties and think about what varies, what creates the setting in a regional sense, we can think immediately of climate, geology, and topography. A catchment is the area, as you see below in this figure. The catchment is the area of Earth that catches water that flows into an aquatic system. And so the catchment attributes are the next scale down. The catchment can be composed of different sorts of vegetation and soils, or sometimes rock types, and also the kinds of hydrologic effects, how much water falls on it, and with what frequency, duration, and intensity. Next, moving down in scale, system attributes, thinking more on a local scale, that the morphometry of an ecosystem, that is its shape, whether it stratifies or not, its flushing rate and sedimentation rates, all have an effect on a smaller scale on the individual system. Other factors, even smaller in the hierarchy, that influence how the function of an ecosystem varies would be light and temperature, things like turbidity, salinity, and water discharge, humic substances, nutrients, toxins, a variety of smaller scale effects. Then moving down even farther, there are two kinds of biological properties that have a large influence on ecosystem function in the aquatic world, and that would be some biological and ecological properties such as the biomass, the productivity, the trophic structure, that is who eats whom, as well as the biodiversity, have effects on how the system functions. And then other biotic effects, that is the human effects such as habitat destruction, harvesting, over-harvesting, nutrient and sediment input, toxic substances, hydrologic alterations, and human-induced climate change, all also have a smaller scale effect on the function of an individual ecosystem. There's a hierarchy of effects that within some effects are on a regional scale, some are on a very small scale, including interactions between minute species of organisms interacting within any given aquatic ecosystem. So we're going to look at a variety of different kinds of ponds, lakes, streams, rivers, estuaries, and oceans, and talk and think about the variety and nomenclature that we use to label these different kinds of systems. So I'll take you on a tour, and we'll go from lakes such as those that I've studied. Here you see a highly structured lake on the border between Manitoba and North Dakota. You can see some very interesting structure on the bottom of that system. We'll talk about the sea, and we should be able to work our way right around all of the systems that grade between the uplands and the oceans. So we need to ask ourselves, what distinguishes different kinds of aquatic systems? It's obvious to you that the ocean is different, I'm sure, from a pond. And one of the ways, of course, things are different is the scale, the size. That has a very large effect. But there are many other kinds of things that should be quite obvious also to you. Salinity, obvious difference between oceans and freshwater lakes. It's very important physiologically and drives not only how organisms work, but what organisms can live in particular ecosystems. And physics is also very important. And this physics drives things like turbulence and currents. And you can think of a very calm pond up to a very rapidly moving stream. The physical forces are very different, and they influence the type of life form and whether you have drifting versus attached sorts of life forms and how they make a living. Of course, those are two very big gradients, and we'll use those first, working across gradients of salinity and physics to think about the different diversity of aquatic systems that exist in the world. But there are certainly other gradients too. There are gradients of solutes, and one that's really important that we'll learn about a lot in this course are the nutrients, especially nitrogen and phosphorus, have a big effect on what grows and how things function. The permanence and depth of a system also has a big influence on the function of a system, and the vegetation and the climate, and the list goes on. And you can hearken back basically to the variety of different factors that you saw in that previous table. We'll start, though, by looking at differences in salinity and physical forcing in aquatic systems, just to get a sense of the diversity, how systems are different and how they are similar. So here we see my two favorite gradients. We have a gradient on the left-hand scale from low to high turbulence, currents and turbulence, and from low to high salinity on the top. And I've tried to color this in a way that would sort of remind you where you are. This is hotter colors over here, so it is sort of hotter in terms of salinity, and this is sort of purpler over here, and that indicates very high turbulence and physical forces that operate within the systems. So we'll just sort of pick through things little by little and have a look at a variety of different kinds of ecosystems. And we can go from sort of one extreme to the other and then hop around. I would start here with wetlands. Wetlands are terrifically important on the planet because they're very productive. They're sites of groundwater recharge, and they also are areas where there's high biodiversity and a tendency to clean out pollutants that fall into them. So they're very important. Here you see a variety of different kinds of wetlands. In the upper right are sort of the open wetlands that you might see in the Midwest U.S. You see some sort of boggy, large wetland systems here down on the lower right, and then a close-up look at some marshes within woody areas, which are also very important wetland ecosystems. These exist virtually, as we will learn later, within almost every biome across the planet. So those are the wetlands. Let's see. Let's simply move up in turbulence. We go from wetlands to ponds. Now, ponds are normally small, and a pond is usually defined as, well, very much like a lake, except for it doesn't have a wave-washed shore. So ponds, also there are many ponds in the world, and these tend to be very important for fish production, also like wetlands for cleaning pollutants out of water, and are also an incredibly great source of biodiversity. So here we see some alpine ponds, more sort of, here's a boreal forest, a sort of pond in the more temperate zone. So very many different kinds of ponds. These are small ecosystems, very much. They're small permanent ecosystems usually, although there are temporary ponds that are very important in some prairie areas. Smaller systems than lakes, but very much similar to them. Moving up in the hierarchy to lakes, lakes are it's quite obvious to you what a lake is. It's a much larger water body. At the lower right, you see some of my favorite lakes. This is in northern Minnesota. These are glacial lakes, and you see a huge variety of different shapes and forms. The red, by the way, is an infrared photo. It's not actually red vegetation or maples in autumn or something like that, but it's an aerial photograph. Here's another kind. This is a lake in Quebec, a lake on top of a mountain in the province of Quebec. And here we have Lake Tahoe, which is a very famous lake. Lakes are large aquatic ecosystems. They can be freshwater or they can be salty. But most of the famous ones that we think about, like Lake Superior, Lake Baikal, and so on, are relatively fresh systems. Moving up in turbulence would get us to the high-order streams. High-order streams look kind of a lot like lakes, but they're flowing, and they're flowing in a continuous fashion. You may not even be aware that they're moving, but they are moving in a regular direction, not simply sloshing back and forth, but flowing. High-order streams are those large streams like the Amazon. Here's another one of the Amazon basin. The Ohio River is shown also. These are large order streams. They're wide. They're a little bit more turbulent than lakes are. Now, going to the low order stream, this is what you might think of as a stream. Usually these are moving pretty fast with often like a babbling brook, or sometimes very, very rapidly moving in the mountains. Here are a variety of them. This one has a high sediment load. This is a glacial outwash kind of stream, kind of a classic meandering stream in a semi-prairie area. Moving even higher in turbulence, we go to lake surf zones. Here you see some beautiful photos of Lake Superior, a very strongly wave-washed shore with physical factors. The water is very fresh, but the physical factors are driving a lot of the kinds of organisms that can live there. These can be very dynamic and very dangerous for boating and so on. They tend to have a lot of turbulence. So we've gone now in freshwater systems from the wetlands all the way to the lake surf zones, staying in the fresher waters, but moving up in turbulence. Now let's move a little over to the right and see what kinds of more saline systems there might be that we might be interested in. Here we have coastal wetlands. These will usually be brackish water or on the edge of estuaries. So they will be mixtures of salty water and fresh water. And coastal wetlands are really very important sort of things like primary production, wildlife growth and protection, and so on, and also water quality protection for the sea. They're also nursery areas, oftentimes for various kinds of marine life. Now, getting a little bit saltier, we get up to the estuaries, and these again are not very rapidly moving. Here we see some ponds inside of a beach zone with sand deposition, so very much less turbulent than the ocean or the coastal zone itself. They tend to be again mixtures of saline water and fresh water, and so can run the range of salinities from rather low to really very high, depending on the flow rates of water, where the water comes from, and what the tidal flow is. Now, getting a little bit more turbulent, we move up to river deltas. River deltas, as you can see, will be also intermediate sorts of intermediate kind of salinity, but in fact will have a substantial amount of turbulence as the water flows into the marine and coastal zones. And then moving a little bit higher into the coastal waterways, some of these are very turbulent indeed, often due to wave action and boating and a variety of other things. Here we have a couple of coastal waterways. They tend to be quite turbulent, but also of intermediate salinity. And now we're getting up into the oceanic zone, where the water is of a salinity level that's very close, that is actually what we call thalassohaline, that it's the same salinity as a sea. So here we have the oceanic zone, which is relatively calm underneath the water. Sometimes, we call it this sort of the deep blue sea is what I call it, laughing. But these are oftentimes very, they're obviously the salinity of the ocean, but in fact the physical forces, at least down under the surface, may not be terribly brusque. In oceanic currents, however, this is an image of a current in the Gulf Stream showing the actual flow. This flows as fast as any inland river, so you can have a substantial amount of turbulence even out in the middle of the ocean. And finally, getting to, second to the last, the marine surf zones are very turbulent and of the sort of standard marine salinity, and they're turbulent due to breaking waves and tidal flux and rip currents and a variety of other factors. Thermal vents, here's a couple images of thermal vents. These tend to be quite saline indeed, and can be quite turbulent due to the effects of these very hot currents that come up out of the ocean floor, and these are very challenging environments indeed. Next, there are systems in the world that are even more saline than the sea. You've heard probably of Great Salt Lake and other kinds of very saline ecosystems. Here we have Mono Lake in California. You can see the big pillars of salt. It's a very saline system. It's what's called endoreic in that water flows in but doesn't really flow out anymore. A lot of water has been taken from its tributaries, and so its salinity is extremely high. And finally, some of the most challenging environments for aquatic organisms to live in would be hot springs and thermal streams. And their salinity is extremely high. You can see the salt deposits here, but also turbulence and physical challenges are huge in these kinds of systems. So there's a great variety of aquatic, there is a great variety of aquatic ecosystems on the planet, and two of the major gradients then would be salinity and turbulence, and those two gradients determine in large degree what kinds of organisms can function well in those systems. Next, let's think about sort of a schematic classification of aquatic ecosystems, and you can see this little diagram I made here. Over on the left-hand side, you'll see freshwater systems, and over on the right are marine systems. These would be the saline systems that this is set up very much like the same as the previous display. So we've got salinity as a major gradient going from left to right. Well, clearly these are all a gradation, and I think you've perceived that, I hope, from the last little tour I gave you. But we have gradients in turbulence here across freshwater systems from the lentic to the lotic. So the lentic are things like wetlands, ponds, and lakes, slow-moving systems. The lotic would be the flowing waters, and these form a stream series from first to about 12th order, and we'll learn those concepts when we get to stream ecology. The wetlands are classified by their permanence, their depth, and the kinds of vegetation that exist there, and the lakes are classified by trophic status. That means kind of how much nutrient is there, how productive are they. Also by climate, the mixing regime, whether they mix top to bottom or not, and the electrolytes that are in them. So these form gradients between lentic and lotic systems, and there is often exchange between lakes and streams, especially in chains of lakes. Inland saline systems are situated somewhere between marine and freshwaters. In fact, inland saline systems often have similar kinds of organisms in them, even though they may be way inland. They may have the same kinds of organisms that exist in marine ecosystems. Now, the marine systems we'll not spend as much time on, but we've already sort of gone through that, moving from sort of the coastal to the oceanic. We have this sort of gradient between sort of brackish coastal, estuaries, which tend to be brackish, coastal zones that receive stream and river input, and then oceanic systems. And these are usually classified by water depth, stratum, and climatic zone. So that's another way of looking at the great variety of aquatic ecosystems that exist on Earth. We should think a little about the fresh systems versus saline waters, and I used the word thalassohaline a little while ago. And this is to what we can look down here in green, and inland saline waters are called athalassohaline. So athalassohaline means not sea salt, basically. So they're saline but not due to the sea. And in fact, the salts are quite different. Athalassohaline waters are usually calcium and magnesium carbonates and sulfates, as opposed to sodium chloride driven, as are the seas. Fresh waters are considered to be those to be about 3 parts of salt per 1,000 or less, and that's about 0.3%. These are fresh systems. When you get into saline waters, saline waters are greater than 3 parts per 1,000 of dissolved salts. Now, there are a couple of terms here that are important to remember, and these would be hyposaline, mesosaline, and hypersaline. Now, hypo is like hypodermic, and that means under saline. Meso would be in the middle, and hypersaline would be greater than the salinity of the sea. Mesosaline is in right around the salinity of oceanic systems. Inland waters, so saturation in salt, it tends to be around 350 parts per 1,000. This is what you'll find in Death Valley, and seawater runs about 35 parts per 1,000. So what makes lakes saline? Well, basically, salinity in lakes is driven by temperature and precipitation. So precipitation tends to liberate salts from the landscape and run it into ecosystems. And if the rate of evaporation is extremely high, that is, if the temperature is quite high, then these systems will tend to get very saline. And you can see the salinity gradients. These are contours of equal salinity, so that at very high temperature and low precipitation, or very high temperature almost regardless of precipitation, we tend to get very high salinities. Places like the Dead Sea, the Salton Sea. Great Salt Lake is shown here. It's of moderate salinity, although if you've ever been there, you know that it's quite a saline system. And then here are some of the Spanish saline lakes over here. The number 11 here are the Spanish saline lakes. And then, of course, lakes up here where it's cool with high precipitation, such as you can see Duluth, Minnesota, 3.4 degrees here, and 110 centimeters of rainfall annually, will tend to have very low salinity. Places like Des Moines, Iowa, which have higher temperature here, and a slightly lower precipitation, will have a little bit higher salinity, whereas Yuma, Arizona, with a very high temperature out here at 23 and relatively low precipitation, any systems there that are closed basins will likely be quite saline, simply because of the balance between precipitation and temperature and evaporation. So this can give you some sense of where, at least in North America, you might find saline lakes. In fact, you find lots of saline lakes over in sort of from the Dakotas on over to the rain shadow of the Rocky Mountains, and you can see those shown in this graph and this picture, and it basically shows where all the saline systems are, and the stippling is arid system and the arid environments, and the very dense stippling is semi-arid. And so we have quite arid environments throughout this area, and this leads often to very high salinities. Here's Chaplin Lake in Saskatchewan. This is a sodium sulfate lake, And here they're actually mining the sodium sulfate that's deposited in this area. And it's a relatively warm environment located within that very saline band going through the middle of North America. And it caused a very big salt deposits to be built up. These, as Glauber's salt or sodium sulfate, is used in the paper industry and a variety of other things. I'm not sure why they, I think fishing must mean digging, and as the sign says, caution active fishing area, kind of doubt there are any actual fish there, so it must have something to do with digging out these salts. Inland waters tend to grade from streams to lakes to wetlands, and here's another way of looking at this. On the left-hand side you see rivers, on the right-hand side you see lakes, and there's a continuum of exchange. Somewhere in the middle between rivers and lakes you'll find reservoirs, or what I call impoundments, and these are areas where rivers have basically been dammed up and the water's been held back. So on the bottom of this graph you see an arrow that shows increasing average residence time. So what does that mean? Residence time means how long the water stays there, going from days in terms of rivers and streams. As we saw, the average stream water residence time on the planet is about 32 days, up to many years for some large lakes. And there are different kinds of reservoirs too. There are mainstream run-of-the-river reservoirs. These are rivers that really don't have much pool behind them, but they're used often in hydroelectric power generation. So they tend to be deep, but not with a very large amount of water backed up. And they have a really fairly rapid turnover rate. There are mainstream storage reservoirs, such as those that are used for flood control and so on. And even farther out to the right, you'll see tributary storage reservoirs. These are the very large reservoirs that basically keep metropolitan areas safe from flooding. So the couple of other terms that are important to remember, and then we use them pretty frequently in the rest of these modules, but these are lentic versus lotic, and I've already used them once, so you probably know what they mean. But lentic comes from lentus in Latin, which any of you who speak any Latin language, you'll recognize that root as meaning pretty slow. In French, lent means slow, L-E-N-T, and this is standing water, and the water motion is not continuous and directional. Lotic systems, the word lotic comes from lotus, which it means washing. So this is water that is washing over the surface of the stream. It's water that's in continuous and directional motion. So those are two important terms, lentic and lotic. Now, here I'd like to talk about the longitudinal structure of lotic systems, and I alluded to this just a little while ago. That there are small streams and there are large streams, but we talk about them usually in terms of their stream order. So if you take the smallest permanently flowing stream, this is called a first order stream. And if you branch together two of those first order streams, say at this point here, then you create a second order stream. Now the second order stream will stay a second order stream until it's joined by another stream of equal stream order. So union of two streams of order n creates a stream of order n plus 1. Union of a stream of order n with a stream of order less than n does not alter the order of the resulting stream. So you can see this stays a third order stream here. It stays a third order stream when it's until it's joined by another third order stream, and then the stream becomes a fourth order, and so on. The largest rivers in the world are 12th order streams. Stream order has a really large influence on how streams work, and these are a couple of graphs from John David Allen's book on stream ecology. Here you see on the x-axis the stream order. These are the little things down here. These are the bigger streams, and these are taken from North America. And here we have the stream length. So, not surprisingly, little streams are shorter, and larger, higher order streams tend to be longer. Also, within a landscape, the number of streams of a given order varies substantially with the stream order. So there are many, many small order streams or low order streams on Earth, and very many fewer high order streams. We think there's one 12th order stream, although it's hard to know exactly, and that's the Amazon. There may be another one in Russia or Siberia, but we're not exactly sure yet. It looks to be looks as if there are one or maybe two other 12th order streams, but we're pretty sure that the Amazon is 12th order. So clearly there are not very many of them, maybe like one or two on the entire planet, and so there are lots of small order streams and not so many high order streams. This is how stream order and width co-vary. So you can see on the y-axis the stream width in meters. A meter, again, is about a yard, something like that for those of you who work in the imperial system. And you see the Strahler stream order, how many branchings it's gone through. On the x-axis, it should be clear to you that the stream width can be quite high when you're in high order streams, a kilometer or 2 kilometers wide when you start looking at places like the mouth of the Amazon, which is over at the far right, or the mouth of the Mississippi, which is a 10th order stream. Here's a lovely littoral zone. Here's another littoral zone. Littoral means the shallow shore zones. And this gives us some sense about how wetlands differ. Those are a couple of different wetland systems. There you can see this is Typha cattail with some water lily down below it. So lentic systems are a blended series from wetlands to lakes, and I showed you that on the little diagram a little while ago. Now, freshwater wetlands differ in some more in a diversity of ways, and lakes differ from one another based on a variety of other kinds of factors. So freshwater wetlands differ basically in permanence, depth, and the type of vegetation and cover that are in those systems. So there are sort of a lot of important wetlands that are not permanent. They vary in depth a great deal, and they vary in vegetation. Lakes, on the other hand, we usually distinguish them from each other based on climatic zone, mixing regime, trophic status. Trophic status again here means fertility, and the amount of electrolytes or alkalinity or salinity or water hardness in those systems. So ecologists assume that different structure leads to differing function, and that's why we pay close attention to the structure of the diverse kinds of lakes and wetlands. We will repeat this later, and this is maybe a little bit hard for you to see on your screens, but this is a wetland classification from Fish and Wildlife Service classification of wetlands, which is called Circular 39. And what I'd like you to see from this there are about 11 different kinds of inland wetlands, and they vary in salinity. Here we have the fresh ones in blue, and we have green ones in the saline ones in green. We see they differ in permanence. Some of them are temporary, some are permanent, both in freshwater and in saline systems. And they differ in depth, with the lowest, the type 1, as you move up the typology to the saline systems, you tend to get deeper and deeper systems, getting deep as 10 feet, 3 meters, 4 meters in depth, something of that nature. And the bogs can be 10 meters or 30 feet deep or more in some boggy systems. So these are the different differences among wetlands. They differ in salinity and permanence and in depth. They also differ because of these factors in vegetation, and I will go through this in much more detail later, but I just wanted you to be aware that the 4 major factors that distinguish wetlands are salinity, permanence, depth, and type of vegetation. There are different kinds of lakes too, and they function very differently. When limnologists talk about lakes, they usually distinguish them based on three different things. First, related concepts of climatic zone, morphometry, and mixing regime. And this has a long history, going back to the late 1800s. They also distinguish them more and more these days based on trophic status, that is, fertility, that is, how much nutrient is in them. Are they clear water, or are they rich in nutrients and therefore very turbid or green in color? And limnologists also distinguish lakes based on their electrolytes, and we think of things like the salinity, hardness, and alkalinity of those lake systems. So climatic zone and morphometry interact to determine mixing regime, and we will review this when we talk about thermal mixing. But we generally find about three kinds of climate zones, and those would be polar, temperate, and tropical. Much of the limnology in the world has been done on temperate zone lakes, the middle category. But what I want you to see here is that in some systems, in some climate zones, the surface temperature may never get greater than 4 degrees Celsius, and that is a very important point in the sort of density and temperature graphs. But the thermal regime and characteristics of the lakes make them mix never, sometimes once a year, and many times per year. And as I say, we'll review this. We'll go over this again when we're talking about temperature and stratification. Alkalinity and hardness and carbon dioxide are important characteristics. Softwater lakes are those that have very low calcium and magnesium in solution. You hear about water softeners. These don't really soften your water, make it softer. What they do is they add sodium chloride that makes soap work better. The calcium and magnesium, hard water is often softened, oddly enough, by adding solutes rather than taking them away. Hard water lakes are the ones that have difficulty with making soap work very well. So soap is sort of reactivated with sodium chloride addition. But soft water lakes are those where there's a lot of rainfall and a lot of through flow of water, and salts don't get a chance to build up very much. Hard water lakes are those where there is a lot of salinity. In various countries around the world, actually, they'll tell you to add more or less soap to your laundry or to your dish washer, depending on the hardness of the water, because it does have a big effect on how soaps and detergents work. Now, here's a concept. This is trophic status, and this is really an important thing to remember, and we'll talk about this a lot. And the first two columns after the labels there, oligotrophic and eutrophic systems, these are extremely important for you to know something about. Eutrophication as a process is one of the most harmful human-driven processes that happens to aquatic ecosystems. Oligotrophic lakes are those that are clear water, and ironically, there's the production or productivity or growth of things is fairly low in those systems, but in fact, they tend to be very healthy. These are the ones that we really enjoy. They're great for recreation. They actually usually have very good fisheries, very nice balanced fisheries, although productivity of fish as just sort of mass of fish is not terribly high. But they do have a great deal of productivity of the kinds of fish people like to catch. So oligotrophic lakes tend to be deep. They have a large hypolimnia, and that's the deep water. They have cold hypolimnetic temperature. They usually are low in organic matter, low in alkalinity, or, they're usually sort of soft water, low in nutrients. They have very low humic matter. They usually have lots of oxygen in the deep waters. They rarely have any aquatic weeds or have very many aquatic weeds, although those that are there are very healthy and speciose, that is to say they have high biodiversity. Plankton abundance tends to be low. Plankton richness, that is, number of kinds of things for fish to eat, is very high. Algae blooms really don't occur very much. And benthic organisms that fish eat also, they have high abundance of benthic organisms. And fish tend to be deep-dwelling, cold water fishes or cool water fishes. And salmonins, that would be things like trout and salmon and whitefish. Eutrophic lakes, on the other hand, tend to have very abundant nutrients, and that's the driving factor behind the change in trophic status from oligotrophic to eutrophic. They tend to be shallow because they fill in fast. They tend to have a small hypolimnion or very little cool water down below. Hypolimnion is cool, but usually it can be very warm. Organic matter is abundant. Alkalinity tends to be variable. Humic matter is pretty low. But hypolimnetic oxygen is very low. Aquatic weeds tend to be very abundant, and there's a lot of plankton that grows, but it usually is not as healthy a plankton and source of fish food as you'd find in an oligotrophic system. Benthic organisms tend to be poor to absent, and these lakes tend to have fish that are sort of warm water fishes, and sometimes fish that people don't really enjoy catching very much. They tend to be on their way to turning into a wetland by sedimentation, whereas oligotrophic lakes are succeeding or moving toward wetland systems over time. Dystrophic systems lakes are those brown water systems that can have a lot of nutrients in them, but they have very low available nutrients. Primary production is very low. These tend to be bog-like ecosystems, and so we call them dystrophic, and it's like dysfunctional in a way. At least that's where the word came from. Characteristics that differentiate aquatic ecosystems in general are many, but freshwater lakes are distinguished based on their fertility or trophic status, the climate, the mixing regime, and electrolyte concentration, that is salts and things. Freshwater wetlands are distinguished based on permanence, depth, and vegetation, and also on salinity because there are a lot of saline kinds of wetlands. Freshwater streams and rivers are distinguished based on order and climatic zone. Saline lakes on the concentration and chemical species of salts found in them, as well as drainage basin and climate. And marine ecosystems are usually distinguished from one another based on their proximity to land, their freshwater input, the water depth, and the kinds of strata that one is considering. So a summary of session 2 is quite simple. There are large and small scale factors that influence the function of aquatic ecosystems. And second thing we looked at the very different kinds of aquatic systems and found that they're distinguished by things like salinity and turbulence, but then a whole host of other kinds of factors determines who can live in the system and how it functions, what are rates of primary production and secondary production and fish growth and so on. Nutrients, and that is its eutrophication status, we will find is a primary distinction among the continental waters, or the waters found on the surface of the continents. That would be the inland lakes, streams, rivers, ponds, and wetlands.